All right, my clock says 12:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just want to start by welcoming everybody to the IFAM seminar series. My name is Renad Vedas. I'm the chair of the Department of Medical Social Sciences. I'd like to take this moment to remind you all that we are not going to be monitoring chat during the seminar, but when you have questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function, and I will be monitoring the Q&A, and we will have time at the end of Dr. Shani's talk to answer those questions. So thank you again for using Q&A, not chat. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our guest speaker today, Dr. Billy Shani, who's a professor at the Institute for Social Research and director of Data Science for Dynamic Decision-Making Center at the University of Michigan. We are so lucky to have Dr. Shani visit us today. I'm going to keep this brief because you want to hear from her and not from me. But I just want to tell you a little bit about her research interests, which focus on innovative intervention science research methods, specifically harnessing adaptive interventions to transform healthcare. Adaptive interventions are able to address the changing needs of individuals by modifying treatment based on dynamic information that comes in real time about the state and progress of an individual. And there's all kinds of fancy trial methods, including the JEDI, or the just-in-time adaptive intervention, as well as others that we'll be learning about. Dr. Shani's work is highly transdisciplinary, spanning behavioral health and applied psychology, while also being tightly integrated with advanced research methods. Her work is at the cutting edge, so we're in for a treat as Dr. Shani helps us all consider how we might infuse these very innovative and paradigm-shifting approaches into our own work. So thank you so much for joining us. Without further ado, I will pass the baton over to you, Dr. Shani.
Thank you so much, Rena. Thank you for inviting me. It's a really pleasure to be here. What I'm hoping to do in the next 45 minutes is to tell you more about some work that I've been doing over the past few years to develop a new experimental approach. It's called a hybrid experimental design. And just to note that when I say hybrid, I don't mean hybrid effectiveness implementation, although these designs can also integrate implementation research. But when I say hybrid, I mean blending different kinds of trial designs for optimizing interventions. And I promise I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that, okay? All right, so before we start, I wanted to thank my amazing collaborators. I also wanted to thank NIH, especially NIDA and NCI, for funding this work. I also wanted to mention that all the examples that I'm going to show you today, they're based on work by Maureen Walton from the University of Michigan. This is an R01 funded by NIAAA, but I modified all the examples for illustrative purposes. So this is not how they were implemented in practice. All right. So what is the gap that these designs are trying to address? We know that with recent investments in technologies such as EHRs, wearable devices, mobile devices, we have so many opportunities to extend the reach and the impact of treatments. With digital technologies, we can also monitor people continuously so we can obtain rich and granular data about their state and their context, and we can use this data to adapt the delivery of support to people's rapidly changing needs in daily life. So there's a lot of potential there, but I think that to fully take advantage of this potential of digital technologies, we have to figure out how to best integrate them with human-delivered components. And the reason I think it's important to be mindful about this integration is because each component brings its own advantages and disadvantages to the table. For example, think about human-delivered components such as coaching sessions. These can increase supportive accountability and therapeutic alliance, which can increase treatment engagement. And we know that treatment engagement is critical for treatment success. But what is the downside? The downside is that human-delivered components are typically burdensome and typically costly. Now, let's think about digital components. Let's think, for example, about a prompt from your mobile device, encouraging you to take a walk, take a deep breath and count to 3, be mindful in the moment. These components are relatively inexpensive, hopefully, typically less burdensome compared to human-delivered support, and they can also extend therapeutic contact beyond the clinic. But what's the downside? There's always a downside. The downside is the suboptimal engagement of people in digital technologies, in digital interventions. You see across the board, different types of interventions, different populations, different digital tools. We see people using the digital tool a few times, and then they stop. They stop either immediately or gradually, but they do stop before they fully benefit from the intervention. So we have to figure out how to best integrate human-delivered and digital components so that people can benefit from both worlds. But the question is, how do we do that? You see, we don't know how to best sequence and adapt human-delivered and digital components simultaneously. But what do we know? Okay, this is just an overview of my talk. I'm going from left to right, and I'm going to mention a few definitions, but I promise I'm going to mention them again later. What do we know? We know that human-delivered components can be adapted on a relatively slow timescale. So what do I mean by adapt? By adaptation, I mean the evidence-based and the protocolized use of dynamic information about the person to decide whether and how to intervene. Notice it's not enough that we're using dynamic information about the person to make intervention decisions. That process has to be evidence-based and protocolized. And when I say slow time scale, I mean over a few weeks or over a few months. And I know that slow and fast is relative, okay? But for now, let's focus on a few weeks or a few months. Now, if you want to develop an intervention in which human-delivered components are adapted on a relatively slow time scale, it means typically that you want to develop what we call an adaptive intervention or standard adaptive interventions. Now, if you investigators, if you have scientific questions about how to best construct an adaptive intervention, there are existing experimental approaches that you can use, such as the SMART, the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. Okay, very nice. What do we know about digital components? Again, think about the prompt from the mobile device. This can be adapted on a much faster time scale, every few days, hours, minutes, seconds. And if you want to develop an intervention in which digital components are adapted on a fast time scale, it means that you want to develop what we call a just-in-time adaptive intervention, or a JEDI. Now, some people call it JEDI, but we call it a JEDI for obvious reasons, because we want the force to be with us. But that's not the point. The point is that if you have scientific questions about how to best construct a JEDI, there are existing experimental approaches that you can use, such as the MRT, the micro-randomized trial. But what if you want to develop an intervention in which human-delivered and digital components are integrated and they are adapted on multiple timescales, both slow and fast? In other words, what do you do if you have scientific questions about how to best construct a multi-model adaptive intervention? This is why we've been working to develop the hybrid experimental design. So what I'm going to do in this talk, I'm going to start by telling you more about adaptive interventions in the SMART. Then I'm going to tell you more about JEDIs and the MRTs. And then I'm going to show you how these concepts can be connected to multi-model adaptive interventions and the hybrid experimental designs. I'm going to show you how hybrid experimental designs can help you answer a variety of scientific questions about how to best construct a multi-model adaptive intervention, how to best integrate human-delivered and digital components that are adapted on both timescales, slow and fast. All right, but before we start, there are two distinctions that I want to make. The first distinction is between an intervention delivery framework and an experimental design. So what is an intervention delivery framework? Sometimes we call it an intervention design, and I think this is why people find it confusing. They think that it's an experimental design, but it's not. An intervention delivery framework is the answer to the question, how should practitioners implement, deliver the intervention in practice? By practitioners, I mean the people who actually deliver the intervention in practice, coaches, therapists, teachers, and so on. What guidelines, what procedures they should follow to deliver the intervention in practice? That's an intervention delivery framework. So what is an experimental design? An experimental design is the answer to the question, how should we investigators, researchers, how should we systematically manipulate independent variable so we can answer scientific questions of interest. So here, the SMART, the MRT, and the hybrid designs, they're supposed to help us answer scientific questions about how to best construct different kinds of adaptive interventions. Now, in an experimental design, we have randomizations. People are assigned randomly to experimental conditions. Why do we have randomizations? Because we want to answer causal questions. We want to make causal inference with relatively minimal structural assumptions. In intervention delivery frameworks, there are no randomizations. So you're not going to have randomizations in adaptive interventions, HEDs, and multi-model adaptive interventions. Because think about it, the goal of an intervention delivery framework is not to gather scientific information. It's not to answer scientific questions. It's to guide practitioners as they deliver the intervention in practice. And when you give someone a protocol, telling him how to deliver an intervention in practice, you're not randomizing, right? So no randomizations in adaptive interventions, HEDs, and multi-model adaptive interventions, but we do randomize in SMARTs, MRTs, and hybrid designs. All right, the second distinction that I want to make is between optimization and evaluation. All the trial designs that I'm going to talk about today, these are not evaluation RCTs. These are optimization trials, optimization RCTs. And what's the difference between optimization and evaluation? This is the definition from Linda Collins's 2018 book on optimization. But basically, optimization is the process where you figure out systematically which components to include in the intervention and how to integrate them in such a way that the intervention package would be effective and resource efficient. That's optimization. And Linda, in her book, when she talks about optimization, she calls this process looking under the hood. And I really like this because every time I think about optimization, I'm thinking about the process of building a car. This is something that I was always fascinated about, but never got a chance to do. But when I think about building a car, I'm thinking, okay, I need to select the parts and put them together in such a way that my car will be fast, but not just fast. It needs to be efficient. It has to be safe. It has to be friendly to the environment. And guess what? I need to do that before I take my car for a ride and compare it to other cars to see if it's better. Hopefully it's better. And I like this analogy because when we optimize interventions, the first thing that we need to do, well, not the first thing, but an important part of the process is to make sure that we select the components, we integrate them in such a way that the intervention, overall, the package is effective and resource efficient. And then we can take it for a ride and we can compare it to standard of care, to a control condition using a standard randomized control trial, using an evaluation trial. Okay, so all the trial designs I'm going to talk about today, these are optimization trials. These are not evaluation trials. Hopefully, they're going to help you figure out how to best put together your components, create a package that is effective, and then you can conduct a randomized control trial, comparing it to a suitable control. All right, so I think now we're ready to talk about adaptive interventions. So I promised I'm going to repeat definitions. What is an adaptive intervention? It is an intervention delivery framework. It guides how practitioners should deliver the intervention in practice. But it's a special case of an intervention delivery framework because it guides how practitioners should adapt interventions in practice. And by adapt, I mean how they should use dynamic information about the person to decide whether and how to intervene. And this process has to be empirically based and protocolized. Now, why do we adapt? We adapt because we want practitioners to be able to address not only the unique, but also the changing needs of people as they progress over time. And standard adaptive interventions specifically, they're motivated to address conditions that change relatively slowly. And when I say slow, I mean every few weeks or every few months. And again, it's relative. We can talk about other examples later if we have time, where the time scale is a bit different. Okay, so adaptive interventions, because they're trying to address conditions that change relatively slowly, they include adaptation on a relatively slow time scale. And they also typically guide the adaptation of human-delivered components. But they can also guide the adaptation of other components that are not human-delivered that can be adapted on a slow time scale. And towards the end of my talk, I'm going to show you an example of one of these components. But for now, I want you to focus on this example. It's an adaptive intervention for youth who visit the emergency department. The goal is to reduce their substance use. This adaptive intervention starts with a relatively minimal form of support. It starts with a single session in the emergency department, plus a digital intervention that provides tailored messages on a daily basis. Okay, at week 4, they assess the participants' response status. If the participants self-reported to use drugs at week 4, they're classified as non-responders, and they transition to the second phase where they receive remote health coaching. This is human-delivered coaching. Otherwise, they continue with the same initial intervention. So there are two things that I want you to notice here. First of all, this intervention is adaptive. There's an adaptation process here because we're using dynamic information about the person's response status to decide whether or not to add coaching. So it's an adaptive intervention. I also want you to notice the second thing is that the adaptation happens here on a slow time scale. It happens 4 weeks after the initiation of this program. Why do we include an adaptation process on a slow time scale here at week 4? It's because this intervention is motivated to address conditions that change relatively slowly. The goal here is to address early signs of non-response to the initial intervention, which is expected to unfold over 4 weeks. That's why we adapt the intervention 4 weeks after the emergency department visit. That's why we adapt on a slow time scale. So we try to address conditions that change slowly by adapting the interventions on a slow time scale. All right, so far so good. What's the issue? The issue is that in many cases, we investigators, researchers, we have scientific questions about how to best construct adaptive interventions. And I want to share with you 2 questions that I have about how to construct this adaptive intervention for youth in the emergency department. All right, you see, this adaptive intervention assumes that we should start with this relatively minimal form of support. But I'm not sure that's the right way to go. Maybe it would be more beneficial to bring coaching right off the bat, to add coaching to this minimal support. Maybe it would be more beneficial in terms of reducing the number of substance use days by week 16. So that's the first question. Should we start with coaching or not? The second question that I have is how to best address the needs of non-responders. You see, the assumption here is that for non-responders, we should add coaching. But maybe it would be more beneficial, again, in terms of reducing the number of substance use days by week 16, by simply continuing with the initial intervention. Just give non-responders more time with the initial intervention. So you see, I have 2 questions. What I want you to notice here is that I repeated the outcome that I'm focusing on. There's a reason. I sounded like a broken record. Reducing the number of substance use days by week 16. It's because I wanted you to notice that the outcome here that I'm focusing on is relatively distal. And later on, when I talk about a JEDI, I'm going to show an example where the outcome is proximal. So I want you to be mindful of the difference between the 2. All right, so how do I answer these questions? This is why we have the SMART. What is the SMART? The SMART is just a randomized trial, right? It includes random assignment of participants to experimental conditions. That's all it is. But it's a special case of a randomized trial because it includes sequential randomizations. What does it mean, sequential randomizations? It means that the same person can get randomized multiple times in the course of the trial. In the SMART, each stage of randomizations corresponds to a point in time, a decision point in the adaptive intervention that you want to develop, in which you investigators, you have scientific questions about the selection and adaptation of intervention components. For example, if I don't know how to initiate my adaptive intervention with or without coaching, then instead of starting with minimal support, you see, instead of starting with minimal support, I have a question, so I randomize to the intervention with or without coaching. And then if I need to know how to best address the needs of non-responders, instead of stepping up for non-responders, because I don't know if I should, I re-randomize non-responders at week 4 to either step up or continue. And responders continue with the same initial intervention. So notice I have 2 stages of randomizations. I'm randomizing twice, initially and at week 4. Why? Because I have scientific questions about what to do initially and what to do at week 4 for non-responders. The stages of randomizations corresponds to scientific questions that I have about particular decision points in my adaptive intervention. I'm randomizing here on a slow time scale. What does it mean, randomizing on a slow time scale? It means that you only have a few stages of randomizations here, it's 2. And the length of the time interval between stages of randomizations is relatively long, a matter of a few weeks in this case. The reason we're randomizing on a slow time scale is because we have scientific questions about how to best construct an adaptive intervention. And in an adaptive intervention, the adaptation happens on a slow time scale. So to answer questions about this type of an intervention, I need a trial design in which we randomize sequentially on a slow time scale. So there's a connection between how fast you adapt or you want to adapt in the intervention that you're trying to develop and the time scale of the randomizations in the trial design that you're using to answer questions about how to best construct this intervention. All right. But now I want to show you how to use data from this trial to answer the two questions that I showed you earlier. And the reason I want to show you how it's done is because I want to show you how simple it is, but also it's because sometimes when people see a smart like this for the first time, what they immediately see is that this trial design results in 6 individual cells, 6 experimental cells, you see, A through F. So their initial thoughts are, well, she'll never have power to detect effects because she's going to compare individual cells. She's going to compare A to B and A to C and A to D, and she's going to have multiple comparisons, and she's only going to have a small sample within each cell, no power to detect effects. So I want to show you that I designed this smart to answer 2 scientific questions that have nothing to do with comparing individual cells, but they have a lot to do with combining outcome data across multiple cells in different ways. All right, so let me show you how it's done. Remember my first question. The first question is super simple. Should I start this intervention with or without coaching? To answer this question, guess what? All you need to do is take the mean outcome. Remember my outcome, week 16 substance use. Take the mean outcome across the 3 cells in which participants did not start with coaching, compare it to the mean outcome across the 3 cells in which participants started with coaching. You see, this is a comparison of half of my sample versus the other half. And by the way, the reason I'm saying half versus half is because I'm assuming throughout that the randomization probabilities are 0.5. All right. Your entire sample will contribute information that will help you estimate this effect. It's just like a 2-arm comparison. This is the main effect of the first stage intervention components averaging over subsequent components for responders and non-responders. As simple as that. All right, so now let's focus on the second question. Remember, the second question was what to do for non-responders. Should I step up or continue? This question is about non-responders. So I'm only going to use data from non-responders to answer the question. How do I do that? I take the mean outcome across cells B and E, in which my non-responders got the step up, and I'm going to compare it to cells C and F, in which my non-responders got the continue option. So this is a comparison of half of my non-responders versus the other half. My entire sample of non-responders, the focus of this question, will contribute information that will help me estimate this effect. You can view this effect as the main effect of the second stage components among non-responders, averaging over the first stage components. All right, nice and easy. And now we're ready to talk about JEDIs. Because a JEDI is just an adaptive intervention. That's all it is. It's an intervention delivery framework that includes adaptation. It guides how we should use dynamic information about the person to decide whether and how to intervene. But JEDIs are special because the adaptation process happens on a much faster time scale compared to standard adaptive interventions. And when I say fast, again, I mean every few days, hours, minutes, seconds, and again, it's relative. Why? Why do we need to adapt on a fast time scale? It's because we want to be able to address conditions that change relatively fast. And you see, these conditions are not just changing fast. In many cases, they change in people's daily lives outside of standard treatment settings. That's why JEDIs typically guide the adaptation of digital components, because digital components can be delivered in people's daily lives. And digital tools have the capacity to adapt interventions rapidly to the rapidly changing needs of individuals. As an example, I want you to think about the digital intervention from the previous example, the one that youth receive in the emergency department. And suppose that as part of this digital intervention, every day we use ecological momentary assessments, EMAs, and sensors to monitor people's state and context. We use EMAs to ask them about their loneliness, their hopefulness, their stress. We also use GPS to monitor their location. And every day, if this combined information indicates that the person experiences high risk for next day substance use, we trigger a message with a protective behavioral strategy. Otherwise, we do nothing. So notice that there's an adaptation process here, because we're using dynamic information about the person's risk status to decide whether or not to trigger a message. But now the adaptation happens on a much faster timescale. It happens every day. Why does it happen every day? It's because we're trying to address conditions that change on a daily basis. You see, we're trying to address risk for next day substance use, which is expected to unfold on a daily basis. That's why we adapt the intervention every day. That's why we adapt on a fast timescale. All right. Again, it's very simple, but we investigators, we have many scientific questions about how to best construct JEDIs. And again, I want to share two example scientific questions with you. And the first question that I have is about the average, the overall utility of sending a message with a protective behavioral strategy in reducing next day substance use. I'm not so sure that it's effective in reducing next day substance use compared to nothing. The second question that I have is about the conditions in which a message would be most beneficial. You see here, the assumption is that I should trigger a message when risk is high, but maybe I should trigger a message when risk is moderate to high. So I have two questions. Notice now my outcome is proximal, next day substance use. Why is it proximal? Because now I'm trying to develop a JEDI. I have questions about a JEDI. And in a JEDI, the intervention options are introduced on a fast timescale, and they're trying to generate more immediate change in people's experiences and behaviors relative to standard adaptive interventions. That's why the outcome is proximal. All right, but how do I answer these questions? This is why we have the MRT. What is the MRT? The MRT, just like the SMART, is a randomized trial that includes sequential randomizations. Again, sequential randomizations, it means that the same person can get randomized multiple times in the course of the trial. But MRTs are special because the sequential randomizations happen on a much faster timescale. What does it mean in practice? In practice, it means that the same person can get randomized many, many times in the course of the trial, hundreds or thousands of times. And the length of the time interval between stages of randomizations is relatively short. For example, remember the JEDI that I'm trying to develop. I don't know if sending a message with a protective behavioral strategy on average is useful in terms of reducing next day substance use compared to doing nothing, and under what conditions a message would be most beneficial. In this case, what I can do is I can still collect data every day about the person's state and context from EMAs and from sensors. But instead of triggering a message when risk is high, because I don't know if I should, I randomize every day to message versus no message. You see, I'm randomizing on a fast timescale because I have scientific questions about how to best construct a JEDI in which the adaptation happens on a fast time scale. So again, there is a connection, strong connection between how fast I want to adapt in the intervention that I want to develop and how fast I'm going to randomize in the trial design that will help me answer questions about how to best construct this intervention. All right, so now I want to show you how simple it is to analyze the data from this trial to answer the questions that I showed you earlier. All right, so how do we do that? Remember, the first question that we had is about the average effect of sending a message versus no message on next day substance use. To answer this question, to estimate this effect, all you need to do is take the mean outcome. Remember, now my outcome is proximal, next day substance use, and you can assume that I'm collecting this outcome following each micro-randomization using the EMAs. So I'm going to take the mean outcome across all the days in which participants received a message across all participants, and I will compare it to the mean outcome, the mean proximal outcomes across all the days in which participants did not receive a message across all participants. You see, this is the average proximal effect of sending a message versus no message on next day substance use. It's average because we're averaging over all participants in the trial and all the days in which they were micro-randomized. My entire sample across all the days in which they were micro-randomized will contribute information that will help me estimate this average main effect. And this average main effect, to estimate it, you're going to be leveraging both between person contrasts and within person contrasts in your proximal outcome. And this is why MRTs are so efficient in answering questions about how to best construct a JEDI compared to standard randomized controlled trials. In standard randomized controlled trials, typically you're only taking advantage of between person contrasts. And here you're taking advantage of between and within person contrasts. And of course, what I can do is I can look at the time trend to see how this effect of sending a message versus no message on next day substance use, how it varies with time. Maybe it dissipates with time. And I can also look at moderators of this effect. So I can see under what conditions a message is more beneficial than no message. There are many interesting scientific questions that you can answer about how to construct a JEDI with micro-randomized trial. But now I want to switch to talking about multi-model adaptive interventions, because now you know about adaptive interventions and you know about JEDIs. And now I want to show you that in many cases, investigators want to combine the two. You see, what I want to do here is I want to take this adaptive intervention that I showed you earlier, where the delivery of coaching at week 4 is adapted based on signs of early non-response at week 4. But at the same time, I want the digital intervention that youth receive in the emergency department to adapt the delivery of the messages daily based on daily signs of risk. You see, so I want to create an intervention in which human-delivered components are adapted on a slow timescale, and the digital components are adapted on a much faster timescale. This means that I want to develop a multi-model adaptive intervention. And you can think about a multi-model adaptive intervention as an intervention delivery framework that combines a standard adaptive intervention with a JEDI. So this, again, seems pretty simple, but I can tell you that there are so many scientific questions that we have about how to best construct these multi-model adaptive interventions. And again, now I want to share one example of a scientific question that is keeping me busy over the past few years. I'm very, very interested in this scientific question. This scientific question is about the potential for synergy, for positive synergy between starting with coaching and delivering a daily message. You see, I think that if we start with coaching and not just with the minimal form of support, we can increase supportive accountability and therapeutic alliance, which will increase engagement with the digital messages. So if I start with coaching, on average, the message is going to be more effective in reducing next day substance use because people are going to engage. They're more likely to engage with my message. But how do I answer this question? Is there a positive synergy between starting with coaching and delivering a daily message? To answer this question, as well as other questions about how to construct this multi-model adaptive intervention, we will need a trial design that allows us to randomize participants sequentially to human-delivered components and to digital components on multiple timescales simultaneously. And this is exactly what hybrid designs do for you. You see, to answer the question about the synergy, as well as other questions, what I can do is take the SMART that I showed you earlier, where first I randomized to the digital intervention without coaching and with coaching. And then at week 4, I re-randomized my non-responders to step up with coaching or continue, and responders continue. And at the same time that I randomize on a slow time scale to my human-delivered components, every day I collect data from EMAs and sensors about the person's state and context, and I micro-randomize to either a message versus no message. So it's a hybrid design. It combines the SMART and the MRT. That's a hybrid SMART and MRT. And it randomizes participants on 2 different time scales, on a slow time scale to human-delivered components, and on a fast time scale to digital components. All right, so now I want to show you, because this looks quite complex, how to use data from this trial to answer the question about the synergy. But before I talk about the synergy, actually I want to show you how to analyze data from this trial, just the intuition for it, to answer two other simpler scientific questions, okay? To show you how it works, I want you to be in the following mindset. I want you to assume that I conducted the study and I collected the data. I have two outcomes that I'm interested in. There's a distal outcome, week 16 substance use, measured here, and there's a proximal outcome, next day substance use, measured following each micro-randomization. I'm interested in both from now, okay? I know that we need to choose a primary one. Let's assume it's the distal one, but I'm interested in both. Okay, so suppose that I clean the data. Now I sit in front of the computer, my favorite data analysis software, and the first thing that I want to do with the data is answer the following question. Should my multi-model adaptive intervention start with coaching or no coaching? Is it better to offer coaching initially versus no coaching in terms of my distal outcome week 16 substance use? To answer this question, believe it or not, you're going to need to use exactly the same analysis that we used to compare the first stage intervention components when we only had the SMART. We would take the mean outcome across the 3 cells in which participants did not start with coaching, compare it to the 3 cells in which they started with coaching. That's it, 2-arm comparison. But now the meaning, the interpretation of the effect will be different because we had the MRT in the background. Now, this would be the main effect of starting with coaching versus no coaching, not only averaging over subsequent components for responders and non-responders, but also averaging over the delivery of the daily messages because we had the MRT in the background. So same analysis, but the interpretation of the effects are different. Okay, now say that the second thing that I want to do with the data is figure out if on average it's beneficial to trigger a message versus do nothing in terms of next day substance use. So again, all you need to do is use the same analysis that I showed you before when you only had the MRT. You would take the mean outcome across all the days, mean of the proximal outcome, across all the days in which a message was sent across all participants, compare it to the mean outcome across all the days in which a message was not sent across all participants. Done. Again, you will be leveraging between person and within person contrast in the proximal outcome to estimate this effect. But now the interpretation of the effect is different because you had the SMART in the background. Now this will be the average proximal effect of delivering a message versus no message on next day substance use, not only averaging over all participants and all the days in which they were micro-randomized, but also averaging over the randomizations to human-delivered components in the SMART because you have it in the background. All right, so I think now you know how to answer the question about the synergy. Because remember, this question was about whether the effect of sending a message versus no message on next day substance use, whether it's amplified, is it stronger by starting with coaching? So to answer this question, all you need to do is you need to estimate the effect of delivering a message versus no message on next day substance use among half of the sample who did not start with coaching, estimate the same effect among the other half who started with coaching and compare the two. That's it. It's just like a 2-by-2 interaction. Difference between differences, difference between two simple effects. The proximal effect of the message when coaching was not delivered versus the proximal effect of the message when coaching was delivered. And this interaction can tell us if the effect of delivering a message on next day substance use is amplified, if it's stronger among those who started with coaching. There's a positive synergy between the two components. All right. Data from hybrid designs can help you answer a wide variety of questions about how to integrate human-delivered and digital components that are adapted on multiple timescales. This manuscript here provides an introduction to the hybrid SMART MRT, and it provides the data analysis that you'll need to use with data from this trial. And also it provides a method for calculating power for planning sample size for hybrid designs that combine the SMART and the MRT. It also includes a wide list of scientific questions that you can answer with these kinds of designs. But believe it or not, the combination of the SMART and the MRT is only one hybrid. There are other hybrid designs that differ depending on your scientific questions. So this manuscript here provides an introduction to 3 different kinds of hybrid designs, and again, provides the data analytic method that you will need to use with each. And this manuscript just got published. It provides an introduction to multimodal adaptive interventions and hybrid experimental designs with examples that are specific for HIV prevention and care. All right. So what I want to do in the next, I only have 3 more slides. I promised I'm almost done. I just want to show you results from an actual hybrid design that was implemented and it was completed. These are preliminary results. Okay, these are not the final results. We're still working on analyzing the data. This work is based on an R1 funded by NIDDK with Bonnie Spring, who all of you know from Northwestern. And what Bonnie wanted to do is to develop a multi-component adaptive intervention that integrates human-delivered and other types of traditional components, as well as digital components for supporting weight loss in obese and overweight adults. And in this trial, what happened is we first randomized obese and overweight adults to either a weight loss app alone versus the app plus coaching. The participants' response status was assessed repeatedly, was assessed at week 2, 4, and 8. As soon as the participants showed signs of insufficient weight loss, this was pre-specified. They were classified as non-responders and they transitioned to the second phase where they were re-randomized to 2 types of step-ups, either a modest step-up or a vigorous step-up. Otherwise, they continued with the same initial intervention. So let me tell you more about the difference between modest step-up and vigorous step-up. Modest step-up means that all we added for non-responders was text messages. That's about it. Supportive text messaging. Vigorous step-up means that we added text messages plus a digital component that the participant did not receive earlier. Okay, so if I did not respond to app alone and was assigned to vigorous step-up, it means that I got text messages plus coaching because I didn't get coaching earlier. Now, if I did not respond to app plus coaching and I was assigned to vigorous step-up, I got the text messages plus meal replacement because I already got coaching earlier. Now, remember at the beginning that I said that adaptive interventions, they can also guide the adaptation of components that are not necessarily human delivered, but can typically be adapted on a slow time scale. So meal replacement is one example. All right, but what I want you to notice is that in both cases, the modest step-up and the vigorous step-up, participants got text messages. But I didn't just get text messages, we actually micro-randomized them, okay? So, for example, every day around noon, we micro-randomized participants with 2/3 probability to either a message versus no message. The messages here, they focused on encouraging participants to self-monitor their dietary intake, which is critical for weight loss. And that's why the proximal outcome here was whether or not they monitor their dietary intake with the app in the next 12 hours. The distal outcome was month 6 weight loss and also maintenance at month 12. So I want to show you preliminary evidence for one question that we had about the integration between the traditional human-delivered components and the digital components. This question focuses only on non-responders, and it focuses on the distal outcome, month 6 weight loss. And it's a question about a 3-way interaction. Okay, it sounds complex, but it's not. We wanted to know if the effect of starting with coaching versus no coaching among non-responders, if it varies depending on the type of step-up that non-responders got and the rate of messages that were delivered to non-responders. You see, the reason this question focuses only on non-responders is because only non-responders got the text messages, okay? So that's why it's a 3-way interaction. The interaction between the first stage components, second stage components among non-responders, and the message delivery rate. Okay, so what do we see? On the y-axis, you see the estimated weight loss. On the x-axis, you see the first stage and second stage components. And inside, these dots represent different message delivery rates. Red represents a message delivery rate at the sample mean. This means that participants got a message on 64% of the days. Non-responders got a message on 64% of the days. Green means that message delivery rate was 1 standard deviation above the mean on 74% of the days. And blue means 1 standard deviation above the mean. Participants got a message on 54% of the days. So what do you see? you see that if participants started with app alone, this one and this one, it doesn't really matter what kind of step up they got when they did not respond and what was the message delivery rate that they received, they did not lose much weight. But if participants started with coaching and all they got when they did not respond was the text messages, more messages, higher message delivery rate was more beneficial in terms of weight loss. So when I was looking at this, I thought, oh, this is nice. There's a positive synergy between the messages, the digital component, and the coaching. Very nice. But then I saw this group. This is the group that started with coaching. And then when they did not respond, they got the vigorous step up, meaning they got text messages and meal replacement. For these people, more messages are less beneficial in terms of weight loss, slightly less beneficial. And the question is why? And we think that this might have to do with burden. So think about this group. For this group, think about how many components they got. They got the app, they got the coaching, then they got the meal replacement and the text messages. Maybe for them, too many text messages was just a bit too much. It was too burdensome. And I think this is an important case to consider burden when we build multi-component interventions. All right, with that, I want to open it up for questions, but I want to mention first that our website includes tons of resources that you can use, and these are free of charge. We try to make them as user-friendly as possible. You can use these resources to plan different types of trials, SMARTs, MRTs, hybrid designs, to analyze data. There's code that you can use to analyze data and plan sample size, and there are also training modules that you can use, again, all free of charge, so please check it out if you're interested. And I'm happy to open it up for questions if you have any.
Thank you so much for that incredible presentation. It was so clearly described, and I really enjoyed listening to you. I'm going to ask our participants to use the Q&A function if they have any questions for Dr. Shani. I, of course, have many, so I'll get us started and wait for the questions to come in from the audience. So Dr. Shani, you already started to kind of outline in your last slide some of the resources that you've made available. But I can say, as somebody who hasn't used these methods, they can feel a little bit intimidating. And I'm curious if you have any specific recommendations for where to start if you're an investigator who wants to begin to incorporate this way of thinking and this methodology into their work.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So to help investigators navigate the current literature and as a good starting point, what we did is we developed 2 online modules, one on adaptive interventions and one on SMARTs, and they're available on our website. I mean, if you go to our website and you look for training resources, you can see that. And they're relatively short. We try to make it as concise as possible because we don't want to burden people. Burden is important, an important consideration when you're training. Each one of them, I think it would take you about 30 minutes to 45 minutes to complete, but it will give you a very strong foundation and a sense of direction for where to go next if you want to learn more about these designs. And I can tell you that we have developed a lot of resources. We have many papers that are tutorial papers that you can use, but these 2 modules, I think, can guide you where to go depending on the level of experience that you have with these concepts.
Thank you for that. Another question is, I'm wondering if you can share what some of the challenges are of doing this kind of optimization work.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the biggest challenge is starting with scientific questions and matching the design to your scientific questions. So what happens is that sometimes people see these designs and they get super excited, myself included. And we're thinking, oh, I want to do this. I just want to do this. And then you're trying to find scientific questions to match the design that you want to do. And typically this results in science that is not optimal. The better way, the better course of action to make sure that the science is high quality, and also to make sure that reviewers would see the connection between your questions and the design, is to start with the scientific questions and say, this is what I want to know. And then based on the questions, figure out, do you even need a SMART? Do you even need an MRT? By the way, there are some scientific questions about building adaptive interventions that require 2-arm RCT. And that's perfectly fine, right? So our team, we don't advocate for using SMARTs or using MRTs or using hybrid designs. We don't. Our goal is that researchers would use the right design to answer their scientific questions. The novelty, in my opinion, is not in the experimental design, and it should not be about the experimental design. The novelty should be about the intervention that you're trying to develop and your scientific questions. And sometimes amazing scientific questions and novel interventions can be developed with a standard 2-arm trial or a 3-arm trial, right? So I think that's the biggest challenge. Coming at this from anchoring yourself in the scientific questions and then figuring out what design would work best for you. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to know is, I want to share with everybody, is that this is something that not a lot of people know, because I think the pool of researchers who gain experience in MRTs especially is increasing, but it's not as big. But if you have experience with analyzing MRT data, you know that the primary issue is not the data analysis, right? So Susan Murphy and her team, they developed an analytic method for MRT that are quite simple. I mean, I showed you, essentially, it has the flavor of a 2-arm comparison. But what's complicated is curating the data and getting the data to a point where you can actually use it with the analysis method. And in that process, because the data comes from multiple sources, it comes from EMAs and standard surveys and sensors. There's a lot of work that needs to go into curating the data and also documenting all the decisions that you're making so that whatever you did can actually be replicated. And this, I think, is the biggest challenge, but this specifically relates to MRTs and hybrid designs.
Thank you. So there are a few questions in the Q&A. So I'll start with Dr. Amisha Walia's question. Dr. Walia thanks you for this wonderful presentation and wonders, how do you account for key changes in a participant's status in terms of medication changes and/or changes in social health needs that may affect your findings during time periods or randomization?
I try to collect this data. I try to, first of all, be very mindful of these issues when I design the study. And as long as I'm proactive and I plan data collection for collecting this information, then I can use it in the analysis. I can see if my results differ depending on different stages, on different adherence rates, on different processes that participant went through in the course of the trial. All this can be analyzed as long as I collect the data.
Thank you. Dr. Benji Cavaladze asks, is there a web application for calculating sample size for most trial designs?
Yes, yes. We've been doing a lot of work to get this out there. For smart designs, it's kind of interesting, but you should know that to plan sample size from smart designs, you, in many cases, need a standard sample size calculators for 2-arm comparisons. And these can be found online, and we have some guidelines for doing that. And that's why I kept saying, again, I feel like I sound like a broken record because I say something multiple times so that it would think that the analysis for smarts is most of them are equivalent to 2-arm comparisons. And that's why what you need to plan sample size for these trials typically are calculators for 2-arm comparisons. For MRTs, there are 2 really, really nice calculators. Two of them were developed by Susan Murphy's team. The first one was developed by Panglayo, Susan's former, I hope I'm not mispronouncing his last name. I hope you'll forgive me. Susan's former postdoc. And this one focuses on calculating sample size when the outcome is continuous. And there's another one that was recently released. This one was developed by Tianshan Chen, and it focuses on planning power for MRTs where the outcome is binary. It's a bit more complex, but they made it super simple. So if you go online, it's on our website. If you go to software resources and you search for MRT resources, You can see both sample size formulas, and you're going to see that the documentation is fantastic. They have a user-friendly interface. You don't need to write code or anything. You just plug in whatever parameters that it's asking you to when it spits out the power or the sample size. It's pretty cool. For hybrid designs, I have Monte Carlo simulation approach that you can use because it's more complex. And I have the code out there. I have documentation for it if you're interested in it. But just so you know that John Ziek, my collaborator, and I are also planning to develop a user-friendly interface for this one as well. So hopefully in the next few months.
Wonderful. Dr. Ron Ackerman, our IFAM director, says, wonderful talk, Billy. Is it possible in your last example that messages weren't always completely aligned with the advice from the coaches? In that context, people getting more frequent early coaching may have become confused if adaptive messages seem to encourage them to take actions that differ from the coach.
Yeah.
Perhaps this means the interventions became too complex and they still burned out.
Yeah, that's a really good conjecture. Yeah, I don't know. I think what I do know is that Bonnie's team, they did a lot of work to try to make sure that all the components are aligned. But certainly it's possible that that happened. And this is, just so you know, I think this is the first ever hybrid design that was implemented. And when we were doing it, when we designed it, I don't think that we were actually thinking along the lines of, okay, we want to develop a multi-model adaptive intervention when we designed the trial based on specific scientific questions. It wasn't like that. We got excited. We saw an opportunity to micro-randomize within the SMART. We thought it would be really interesting, but we didn't approach this from very concrete scientific questions. The reason I'm saying this is that now I think there are other hybrid designs in the field that are more driven by concrete scientific questions about the integration between human-delivered and digital components. And there, I think we're a lot more mindful ahead of time about how to make sure that all the components, the digital and the human delivered, would be integrated in a way that is aligned. And you know, things like that, iatrogenic effects would not happen. But this is something I'm definitely going to share with Bonnie and her team and see if there's any way of, you know, using the data to look into this.
Fantastic. Well, and I'm going to ask you one last question, and we'll have to keep it tight because there's only a minute and a half left. But you have been at the cutting edge of these methods. And so when you look to the next 5 years, what are you most excited about what you see in the future in terms of how these methods will continue to develop?
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm excited about two things. One of them, I think I shared with you, Rina, when we just, you know, before I started talking. I see a lot of potential in this work on hybrid designs, especially in implementation science. There's a lot of work in implementation science to try to figure out how to use implementation strategies in a way that is adaptive, that adapts to the changing needs of schools, of health systems, of clinics, and also how to integrate human-delivered support facilitation, for example, with digital support, for example, replicating effectiveness programs and websites that are being used to train clinicians and teachers, for example, and implementing evidence-based treatments. So I see a lot of potential in trying to figure out how to best integrate these human-delivered and digital elements. The challenge here is that in optimizing adaptive implementation strategies, there's usually the multi-level aspect of it because you're intervening on at different levels. You intervene at the school level, for example. I'm just using an example from Amy Kilborn's work. The school and then the teachers, right? Or you intervene on the clinic or the health system and also the providers, the clinicians. And we need to think about how to accommodate these multiple levels in a setting where you also have human-delivered and digital components on multiple timescales. So you have multiple timescales and multiple levels. How do you do that? How do you design a study to be able to develop this adaptive intervention, right? And how do you even conceptualize this adaptive intervention to be able to guide their development? And this is something that Danny Elmer, my colleague, and I have been talking about, and this is the direction that we want to take in our P50 renewal. It's one of the components that we're planning to include. So that's one thing that I'm really excited about, like integrating implementation science more in this kind of work that I'm doing. And the second thing is we have been working on developing an open source platform to accelerate and democratize the development of digital interventions, digital adaptive interventions. Right now, when people want to conduct a study to optimize a digital intervention or the integration between digital and human delivered, they have to reinvent the wheel in terms of software development. They have to develop software from scratch, and it has to be robust and it has to be engaging, but we don't have enough money. So we're trying to develop an open source platform that investigators can use to download modules, software modules, and these modules will allow them to, it's basically software templates that they can use to conduct micro-randomized trials, to embed AI elements, reinforcement learning elements, to integrate EMAs in their studies, and hopefully will be built and the documentation will be generated in such a way that researchers would only need to involve someone with minimal software development skills to be able to mix and match them and adapt them to create their own software. So this is something that we started developing. Our website is already out there, and we're hoping to release the few first modules in the next few months. But there's a lot of work to do in this area, and this is something that I'm hoping to develop further in the next 5 years. So.
Well, thank you. We can't wait to see that work. And we're so grateful to you for your time today. So another big round of applause. Everyone in our IFAM community is very grateful. Thank you.
I was really excited to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation.